Hello and welcome back everybody to THEOPHIS, land of the dragon gods and the cultures that worship them. Today we take a journey to ancient Carthage. But before we do that, I'd like to touch on a few key things which we need to establish up front so that we know what to focus on as we go through this material. And the most important thing I want to draw out to your attention right here is themes. Like the word Theophis, the word theme shares the root the, which is the root word of God. Many similar themes are constantly reoccurring in the cultural mythologies of our world, and it is in charting these reoccurring themes that a pattern starts to emerge, which presents a full, albeit disturbing, picture of humanity's origins and the true nature of our reality. In mythology, there are frequently sinister accounts and motifs in artworks depicting parricide, fratricide, cannibalism, castration, incest, pederasty, rape, and war. A very noticeable recurring theme that comes up repeatedly in artworks, the Bible, in mythology, and indeed historical accounts, is that of sacrifice. And with that, we enter into Punic Carthage. Carthage was the capital city of the ancient Carthaginian Empire, which stretched across the Mediterranean on the eastern side of Lake Tunis in what is now modern-day Tunisia. Carthage was one of the most important trading hubs of the ancient Mediterranean and one of the most influential cities in the classical world. The city developed from a Phoenician/Punic colony into the capital of the Punic Empire, which dominated large parts of the southwest Mediterranean during the first millennium BC. The legendary queen/goddess Elissa, also known as Dido, originally from Tyre, another Phoenician colony, is regarded as the founder of the city, though her historicity has been questioned. According to accounts by Timaeus of Tauromenium, Dido purchased from a local tribe the amount of land that could be covered by an ox hide. The name Carthage stems from Kart Hadash, or new city, which indicates it was a colony initially, then a colony unto its own, sometimes in conflict with other Phoenician settlements such as Tyre. And this is an artist's impression of Carthage. What it was most known for was an incredible harbor, which, being a trading port, it would need to have places where merchant vessels can unload their goods at the ports. But the military were kept in this rotonda here, which you can see is very well protected. There's only one entrance. I would imagine that's very well guarded, but the military vessels are all here, trading vessels on the outside. And this is another view of it over here. Artist's impression. Again, the harbor is what made it so unique because it was an incredibly well-designed harbor, specifically for military conquest as well as trade, designed for the two functions. And this, of course, would be the rest of what was ancient Carthage, with some elevated areas and temples and whatnot going on. Now, to understand Carthage, you need to understand the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians were a very interesting group of people. But before we get onto that, I just want to point out to you where the Carthaginian Empire initially ended up settling, which is an incredible amount of land. So initially, the Carthaginians came from the Phoenicians, but they became an empire into their own, initially settling here, but obviously conquering all the land you see in green and parts of the Iberian Peninsula as well. And of course, the Carthaginian Empire had various territorial gains and losses over the years. The Carthaginian Empire came from the Phoenicians, and the Phoenicians were an ancient maritime empire originating from Canaanites of the Levant region in the Eastern Mediterranean about 5,000 years ago. Or so that's what we're taught in history. Renowned for their skills, they developed a trade network that lasted over 1,000 years, which helped facilitate the exchange of cultures, ideas, and knowledge. Phoenician life and society centered on commerce and seafaring. The Phoenicians were organized into city-states under the kingship of wealthy merchant families, most notable of which were Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, and of course, Carthage. Each city-state was politically independent, and the Carthaginian Empire expanded to include parts of Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, Ibiza, parts of Spain, and the Portuguese south coast. So the most important thing that the Phoenicians gave us is, of course, our modern day alphabet, the phonetic alphabet, not a pictorial hieroglyphic alphabet. The Phoenicians were long considered a lost civilization due to the lack of indigenous written records. And only since the mid-20th century have historians and archaeologists been able to reveal a complex and influential civilization, the inheritors of which are still around today. The best-known legacy of the group referenced as the Phoenicians is the world's oldest verified alphabet, whose origins was connected to that of several languages, including the Hebrew script, via the Proto-Sinaitic script, and which was transported across the Mediterranean and used to develop the Arabic and Greek alphabet, and in turn, the Cyrillic and Latin alphabets, from where we get English. The international trade networks of the Phoenicians is believed to have fostered the economic, political, and cultural foundations of classical Western civilization. The Phoenician oligarchy eventually evolved into the Venetian black nobility, which are still around today and which we commonly reference in our circles as the Roman cult. Now, it's interesting to notice that the root word here, ENIC, of Phoenician is also present in Venetian. They are phonetically cognizant with each other because it is the Phoenician oligarchy, which, as we already said, ended up in what we now know today as the Venetian black nobility or the Roman cult. And those guys are still very much in control today because they have the source code of our reality, which is our language. So this is an example of the Phoenician script, a phonetic, where you get the word phonetic is from the word Phoenician, a phonetic language where each syllable would have a specific phonetic quality, which combined symbols would then form a specific word. And this was a Phoenician invention. And you will notice here the solar disk with the wings on either side. You will see this turning up in Zoroastrian religions of the Mesopotamian area. You'll find this turning up in Egypt as well. This is very commonly used as a symbol in Egypt, is the solar disk surrounded by the wings. Let's talk a bit about the founder of Carthage, being Elissa or Dido. In most accounts, she was the queen of the Phoenician city-state of Tyre, today in Lebanon, who fled tyranny to found her own city in northwest Africa. Dido is described as a clever and enterprising woman who flees her ruthless and autocratic brother Pygmalion after discovering that he was responsible for her husband's death. Through her wisdom and leadership, the city of Carthage is founded and made prosperous. Dido remains an enduring figure in Western culture and arts since the early Renaissance and into the 21st century. In the early 20th century, she was also chosen as the national symbol in Tunisian nationalism, and so Tunisian women can be poetically referred to as the daughters of Dido. Dido, or Elissa, has been represented on the Tunisian currency in 2006. And here is the etymological evidence that indicates that Elissa was, in fact, a goddess. Now, remember, when we speak about dragonology, goddesses and queens are often inextricably linked with each other. Elishat or Elisha is the name repeatedly attested on Punic votives. Votives are devotional offerings given to the gods. So she was attested to be a god. There were devotional offerings given to her. Elisha is composed of the root word El, meaning God, which is a reference to the remote Phoenician creator god El, also a name for God in Judaism. And of course, Elisha is also composed of the Issa, which could be either fire or another word for woman. Other works state that Issa is the feminine form of El. Interesting. And where you further connect Elissa's name with being a goddess is when you look at how the Greeks spelled her name using the THE root word. So Elisha in the Greek text appears as Theoso with the THE root, which also translates into Elisha in our current language. El, of course, becoming Theos, and The is the Greek root word of God, found in words like Theos, theism, monotheism, and theme, as we have already discussed. Again, just a dragonology rule of thumb, and I bring the slide up quite a few times throughout the course of the THEOPHIS presentations because it's important always to remember the basics. The dragonology rule of thumb is that in dragonology studies, whenever we reference rulers, royalty, gods, dragons or serpents, we are referencing the same entities or principal beings, being the dragons of dragonology. Carthage had a very interesting history and played a very important part in the culture of that part of Africa at the time and other parts of the world around the Mediterranean. So I'll give you a little bit of a brief history just so you can get an idea of how it fitted into the context. And as we've already said, it's located in modern-day Tunisia. Carthage is one of the most influential trading hubs in the ancient Mediterranean, as well as one of the most affluent cities of the classical world. The city was destroyed in the nearly 3-year siege of Carthage by the Roman Republic during the Third Punic War in 146 BC. After redevelopment by the Romans, Roman Carthage became the major city of the Roman Empire in the province of Africa, which is the name of Tunisia back then. Africa has since gone on to become the name of the entire continent. And we've also seen this with Ethiopia. The more influential a culture was, we spoke about this last time in the Ethiopian program, the Aksumite Empire was the most powerful empire of the 4th century AD. And as a result, Ethiopia was the name of near enough all of Africa. And it's the same here. This is a very influential empire. And this was a few hundred years before the Aksumite Empire. And of course, same principle applies. Tunisia was called Africa, and this went on to become the name of the entire continent, and that's how it is today. The city developed from a Canaanite Phoenician colony into the capital of the Punic Empire, which dominated large parts of the southwestern Mediterranean in the first millennium BC. So now that we've covered a brief history of Carthage, we're going to go on to the most important part, which, of course, is the dragons. Yes, Carthage has its very own dragon mythologies. It wouldn't be THEOPHIS without the dragons. So on that note, let's get on with it. Here is an article from the Ancient World magazine. By 256 BC, the so-called First Punic War had been raging for 8 years. Its battlefield stretched across Sicily and the waters that surrounded the island, with raids and skirmishes raging as far as the coast of Italy near Rome. In an effort to force an end to the hostilities, the Romans mounted an invasion of North Africa, a strategy only tried once before by Agathocles of Syracuse. Leading this expedition was one of the consuls for Marcus Atilius Regulus. The Attili family supplied a number of successful commanders for the war, and it is fitting that one of them was to lead the army to invade Libya. This invasion, like that of Agathocles, was not successful. It culminated in what is variably known as the Battle of Tunis or the Battle of Bagradas in 255, and the utter destruction of Regulus's army. Of his 15,000 infantry and 500 cavalry, 2,000 was said to have escaped death or capture. In the showdown, the Romans were surrounded by the Carthaginian cavalry and slowly ground down their elephants and the hardened citizen infantry, which made up the core of their battle line. The victory is typically ascribed to the tactical genius of the Spartan mercenary Xanthippus. But before their final encounter with the Punic host and its Hellenic helmsman, they met with a more sinister foe, being a dragon. Regulus and his army had landed at Cap Bon, the promontory which extends from the south of Carthage in the northeastern direction towards Sicily. From there, they marched towards Carthage, which took them through the hostile territories, thanks both to enemy settlements as well as natural environment. It also forced them to march across the river Bragdas. It was there that they met with the enigmatic enemy. The oldest sources for this event comes to us secondhand as a fragment from Aulus Gellius, who copied the version of Quintus Aelius Tubero. Our oldest sources of this event come to us secondhand as a fragment from Aulus Gellius, who copied the version of Quintus Aelius Tubero. According to Tubero, the consul of Atilius Regulus, when encamped on the Bragdas River in Africa, fought a stubborn and fierce battle with a single serpent of extraordinary size, which had its lair in the region. That it might struggle with the entire army, the reptile was attacked for a long time with hurling engines and catapults, and that when it was finally killed, its skin, 120 feet long, was sent to Rome. Anyway, Carthage did eventually fall to the Romans, despite the Romans losing that particular battle. But this is the account where the Roman army under Attalus Regulus encountered a giant serpent or dragon. These are the images of the ruins of Carthage as it stands today. Here's some more ruins. You'll notice a typical Roman Greek style architecture, which has lots of columns and arches. And these ruins are obviously very, very, very well built because these walls are super thick. And here are the ruins of the columns which stem from the Roman redevelopment of Carthage. You'll notice here are the Corinthian capitals on the columns. And the thing about Carthage is very interesting is it was a very advanced and very well-built culture. The infrastructure was incredibly well developed. And you can see this by the remains of these large-scale cisterns. And look at how these old cisterns used to be covered with these roofs, which is obviously now broken down, and there's a little bit of grass growing in them. This is obviously where the waters would. And then, of course, we move on to the ruins of the Tophet. And this is where it gets a bit darker, where we get into the dark side of the Carthaginian information, which deals with sacrifice. For many years, the rumors that the ancient Carthaginians had sacrificed their own young was considered to be propaganda spread by the Greeks and Romans who disliked them and the wider Phoenician civilization. Over the decades, several groups of historians have debated the subject, but they have not yet reached a concrete answer. Most recently, a team led by Oxford historians ruled that there was strong evidence that ritual sacrifice did, in fact, take place. It wasn't an isolated incident either. It happened over several centuries. Today, the tombstones and ritual altars form part of a historical site outside the capital city of Tunis, which was granted World Heritage status in 1979. The cemetery, a hybrid of a sanctuary and a necropolis, forms a striking picture. When it was at its largest, it was over 64,000 square feet and spanned 9 different levels. The word Tophet comes from a place described in Hebrew scripture where people who were influenced by ancient Canaanite religion burned and sacrificed their children to the gods. And here's an image from the excavations in 1921. You can see, as you can see, all these funerary stones, like headstones or votive stones. You can see them here, some of them in obelisk shape. Obelisk, of course, a symbol of the serpent. And notice all the pots of burnt children buried underneath the stones. So here's some more images of the Carthaginian Tophet, and some under the temple. It seems a bit more indoors. That appears to be an altar of some sort. These sites were filled with thousands of pots filled with the charred remains of infants mixed with the bones. A stele was erected above the burial, sometimes inscribed with a dedicatory inscription to BAAL, HAMMON, or Tanit. And we get into those gods in a moment. So let's look at BAAL, HAMMON. So we get into BAAL, HAMMON here. Here are the various ways in which BAAL, HAMMON is written. Other syncretic associations include the Egyptian Libyan god Amun, which you can see comes from the root Ammon here, of Hammon. Also a connection to the Semitic word Hammon, Hammer meaning to heat. And if you think about the Turkish steam baths, which are heated sauna rooms, they're called a hammam because of this root word hammer, which means to heat. So Baal could literally have meant, Baal Hammon could literally have meant Lord of the hot brazier or hot oven. We'll get into why that is right now, but I just want to point something out on this particular piece of sculpture or pottery, terracotta pottery, which depicts Baal Amun. You'll notice an opening at the top of his head. And this was a receptacle. It's a funerary urn where the ashes and remains of whatever was sacrificed was deposited. It's very typical of the Phoenician, Carthaginian people to have funerary urns like this, which actually depicted the gods whilst also holding the sacrificed, burnt remains of the children that had been murdered. And over the chest of Baal Hammon, you can see the open ovens over the fire in which the children were cooked. So now we get a bit more into Baal, also known as Moloch. Originally a Semitic noun, the word Baal means owner or lord, but is now used as a pronoun, often taking on the transliterations of Baal, Baal, Bel, Beel, and Beelzebub. The worship of Baal was popular in Egypt from the later New Kingdom in about 1400 BC to its end in about 1075 BCE. Through the influence of the Arameans, who borrowed the Babylonian pronunciation of Bel, the god ultimately became known to the Greeks as Belos, identified with the Greek Zeus. Here's a few more images. And you can see here someone giving their child over to be sacrificed. And you can see the fires going. Obviously, the child's going to be a burnt offering. And what is interesting to notice is that Baal or Moloch was often depicted with a bull's head and bull's horns. Now we move on to Tanit, who was the Punic goddess figure and chief deity of Carthage, alongside her consort Baal HAMMON. Tanit's symbol was the lion, solar disk, and crescent moon. I'll show you some examples in a minute. Tanit was known by various names in different times, including Astarte, and was recorded in the Akkadian Babylonian as Ishtar, where you get the word Easter from, who is also represented by the symbol of the lion. Interesting to notice here that this statue has Tanit depicted with a lion's head, whereas Baal Amun was depicted as a bull. In Greek mythology, Tanit becomes Europa, consort of Zeus. Europa is said to have been a Phoenician princess, and Europa is where we get Europe from. Here are some representations of Tanit. This is a bust of Tanit found in the Carthaginian necropolis of Puig de Molins in Ibiza, dated from the 4th century BC. Now, you'll notice the receptacle opening on the head, which absolutely indicates that this may have been used as a funerary urn, and most likely a place where the ashes of the sacrificed children were deposited. And this, of course, is a Punic coin featuring Tanit, which was minted in Punic Carthage between 330 and 300 BC. You'll notice the fish, which, of course, can be used as a symbol of the dragon, but also a symbol that this was a maritime culture. Tanit has also been depicted in many different ways. And in fact, there's a very famous statue called the Lady of Elshe, which could very have likely been Tanit. And my personal view is that this absolutely came from the Phoenician Carthaginian Empire in the Iberian Peninsula. The Lady of Elshe is a limestone bust that was discovered in 1897 at La Elucida, an archaeological site on a private estate 2 kilometers south of Elche in Spain. The origins of this artifact is a mystery to most scholars, who have been content to claim that it's of Hellenistic origins. I personally don't believe that, because this does not look Hellenistic at all. It is generally known as an Iberian artifact from the 4th century BC, but it's most likely a Carthaginian artifact depicting the Phoenician goddess Tanit, who was worshipped by the Punic Iberians. The opening at the rear of the sculpture indicates its usage as a funerary urn or a repository for votive offerings, burnt offerings, or sacrifices. Again, this is a funerary urn. It's got an opening where stuff could be put into. So it's very much like you see here, okay, a repository for ashes, and what you see here, which would be a repository for ashes. So this all comes from the same era where these were used for a repository of sacrificial offerings. The ashes would be put into the back here. Here's some more examples of Punic Iberian sculpture. They've been given various names because of where they've been found, but they most likely are also representations of Tanit, the Carthaginian or Phoenician goddess. And the clear giveaway for me that absolutely says this comes from the same culture is the way in which the jewelry and the clothing have been represented. Notice the zigzagging folds over here. The zigzag folds, you've got them represented here, and you have them also represented here on the Lady of Elshe. Now notice the jewelry on the Lady of Elshe, which has these lovely pointed protrusion like pendants. And you also have them here, okay? More of them over here. Interesting to notice these rodettes, as they are called, these circular wheel-like things on the side of the head, a headdress or a crown of some kind. And you will notice there's a rodette protruding over here. All right, so there are various similarities which you can pick up on. There are so many similarities between these three sculptures that they most likely come from the same culture, being the Punic Iberians. Now we're going to go on to the symbolism associated with Tanit, because here's where it gets very, very interesting. There's a lot of recurring symbolism on stele found in the Tophets of Carthage. And now we go on to the recurring symbolism that we found on the stele found in the Tophets of Carthage. And of course, these are all sacrificed to Tanit as indicated by the symbols. This is the symbol of the goddess Tanit. Very interesting. Notice how the formation that we've got here, the little loop at the top, the outstretched arms there, and the bottom. And other symbols, we find the solar disk and the moon, as we've already mentioned, the crescent moon and the solar disk are symbols of the mother goddess. Another symbol here, the symbol of the fish, which we find in the coins over here. Okay, you find that in the coins. So the recurring symbolism and iconography comes up all over the show. And of course, they were an ocean-going maritime civilization. So you'll notice the curls of the ocean there. That means the Phoenician Empire, the maritime empire. And you'll notice some Phoenician script over there, written along the top there. Same symbol, pretty much used over here that we find over here. And again, the solar disk and the crescent moon. And what you will also notice is this recess that they've got. It looks like a door within a door. And you'll find this in so many places all over the world on ancient ruins, doors within doors. You find it on the ancient stele of Ethiopia, the doors within door kind of thing that appear on this massive obelisks, all of which indicate that these cultures have a common origin because they use similar symbols and iconography. And now we deal with a little bit more of the symbols. We're going to deal with this symbol over here and show how it's been variously represented. Here as the crux ansata. A crux ansata in the Codex Glasia, a Coptic manuscript of the New Testament, 4th to 5th century AD. And you'll see the cross, the T with the part going down and the circle on the top. You can see it here on a piece of cloth. This is a Coptic manuscript. And you also find it in Egypt in the form of the Egyptian ankh, the loop on the top with the arms across going down. This is Horus feeding the ankh to Ramses. And here you see it from the crux ansata, or the ankh, that it forms the letter T. Letter T is very important because the letter T, of course, being the first letter of the goddess Tanit, and the root word tan is very interesting. Tan and an in dragonology etymology has huge significance and comes up again and again. So let's break this down. So you've got the tan, the an, and the T. From tan, we find the root an, which you find in ankh, Anunnaki, angui, which is where you get the root word angel, and angui is the Latin word for serpent. The cross of the ankh motifs are where the letter T is derived from, which is the first letter of theism. You'll find that in pantheon, theology, thelema, theosophy, and of course, THEOPHIS. So that's where the letter T comes from. And of course, the T being the first word of the Tophets, which is the area where the sacrificial remains of burnt children were deposited. And when you take away the T's, the T of Tophet on either side, you have the root word ophi. Ophi is the Latin root word meaning serpent. The T, of course, goes on to the word time. And it's interesting because this is where you start to notice the sun iconography coming in. Of course, time is dictated by the sun. And what we have is the 12 divided by 4 parts into 3 individual units. And that is what I call the God code. Another interesting thing to notice here is the cross over here, which would go across there. And the point in the middle of the circle, got the circle or the point in the middle, and symbolic segregation into quarters, because this iconography turns up again and again. For example, in the cross of the zodiac, you have the same thing. You have the 12 sections divided by the cross into 4 parts with 3 individual parts in the middle, and then the point in the center, which would represent the sun And this, of course, is the sun, which is where we get the Christian cross from. And of course, the Christian cross marks out the summer solstice, the winter solstice, the spring and autumn equinoxes, which is when the major sacrificial rituals take place across the world in various covens. There are 4 major sacrifices a year, and this is when they happen. So sun symbolism comes up again and again, obviously because it is a marker of time. And you will notice the sun and the serpent stroke dragon are inextricably linked. You will find the representations of the sun and the dragon coming up over and over again. You'll notice here the crescent moon, a symbol of the goddess. And here we have the sun symbol over here, an anthropomorphized sun. And notice here a lion's head, because that is the goddess Tanit symbol, but also attached to a serpent body. And the vesica piscis, which is this shape here, is also a female symbol. It's meant to depict the vagina. Interesting enough. And here are more evolutions of the serpent sun. For example, this is the Biscion, and it is the symbol of Milan, as well as the House of Visconti. It is also the symbol of Alfa Romeo. It depicts a serpent wearing a crown, eating what looks to be a child. And you'll notice coming out from it are some squiggly lines. You'll notice more squiggly lines here. All of this represents the serpent. Okay, all these squiggly lines are all representations or symbolic representations of serpents. It's easy to see how we get to that. But this is the serpent sun. And the serpent sun is even further stylized in the Jesuit logo, which has the curls, the serpent suns coming out here, the serpents of the sun coming out here, and the IHS, which is Isis, Horus, Seth, the Egyptian Holy Trinity. Horus, of course, being a solar deity, and much like Jesus Christ, Horus was born on the 25th of December, because much like Horus, Jesus was in fact a solar deity, as we can see from the iconography here. The cross behind Jesus's head is simply a representation of the solar symbol, which is represented in the cross of the zodiac, because the cross of the zodiac really is a symbolic allegory that marks the movement of the sun through the course of the year. It is the oldest conceptual symbol known to man. Now we go on to occult symbolism, because this is where it all gets a bit darker. The serpent and the sun symbol is an ancient archetypal symbol that often turns up with other occult archetypal symbolism. Very interesting. So those who follow my work will know what the eye in the triangle represents, and you'll always find these dark symbols surrounded by serpents. But interesting to notice here again, the serpent and the sun, the serpent and the sun, the serpent and the sun, it's always inextricably associated. Solar deities are actually a representation of dragon deities. Okay. And what you will notice is some other iconography here, the crescent moon. And horror, of course, the Baphomet with the wings. Dragons have wings, the cloven hooves, the pentagram, and the horns like a bull or like a dragon would have. But again, just to point out, the solar symbolism, the sun and the serpent symbol always is inextricably linked with various other types of occult symbols. And of course, with all these symbols comes child sacrifice. It's a very unfortunate part of this reality, but yeah, child sacrifice is still going on, and these occult symbols are absolutely representative of this ritual. So this fact is in fact highlighted by a story told by the Greek historian Diodorus Siculus in an account of the siege of Carthage by Anthocles in 310 BC. According to Diodorus, the Carthaginians believed that the siege was the result of a failure to perform proper sacrifices. Noble parents had purchased less worthy substitutes in secret rather than offer up their own children. To make up for this, 200 noble children were chosen to be sacrificed and placed in the bronze arm of the statue of Cronus. While it is impossible to check the accuracy of such stories, the persistence of child sacrifice amongst the Phoenicians is further substantiated by the fact that laws are written to outlaw the practice. Historian Justin states that the Persian king Darius forbade the Carthaginians from offering up human sacrifices. Human sacrifice was again declared illegal in 87 BC before the Roman Senate. Despite this fact, the early church father Tertullian, who was born in Carthage, said that infants continued to be openly sacrificed to Saturn until the proconsulate of Tiberius, and the practice continued in secret in Africa as late as the 2nd century AD. Tertullian further states that priests were nailed to sacred trees for performing the cult. It is claimed that human sacrifice was ended in the 3rd century AD, but in fact, the practice just went underground and kept in secretive orders and societies, and it still goes on to this very day. And just to point out the word Saturn here, because I just wanted to point out this image of Saturn. It's an image by Peter Paul Rubens, Saturn devouring his son. Very, very graphic, that is. So Saturn is where we get, Saturn is of course a deity, and where we get the word Saturday and Satan. Now there's other words for these deities. Baal, Moloch was also known as Kronos, which is where we get chronology or time. We've just spoken about time. That's where time comes in. Typhon is another name. Moloch or Melech is Hebrew for king. We always speak about rulers and royalty and dragons inextricably linked. Baal means Lord. Devil is where we get the root word of evil, devil. And of course, Lucifer means light bringer. And all of these characters or names or lexicons are actually indicating the same principles. It just depends on which culture you're in as to what these deities are called. Drawing to an end of this section on Carthage, we have a look at some of the reoccurring themes that we have discussed in this particular episode. A theophic culture is a culture where serpent or dragon worship goes on. And this is also known as ophiolatry. All right? Please go and Google ophiolatry and have a look for yourself. Serpent worship is the oldest form of religion from which all other religions are derived, which is why you find so much serpent symbolism turning up in all the major religions. And here are the themes that you will find in the section on Carthage, and in fact in most of the sections that we do. We covered this in Ethiopia, and in all the other places that we will visit in Africa, you'll find these same themes coming up again, the theophic themes of serpent or deity worship, dragon worship, a founding of a territory by a queen or a deity stroke dragon, deity worship, votive offerings, ritual, sacrifice of children to deities. And these are very specific themes. You know, for us average everyday people, we probably don't even see or contemplate or conscientize or engage in any of this stuff. It's quite a specific thing. So these things are worthy of taking note of, because these things keep turning up again and again and again. It's not just a historical record based on the accounts of other cultures, but also the extensive remains of sacrificed children found during the excavations, which provides us the clearest evidence of votive offerings to the deities or the dragons or the gods, whatever you want to call them. Carthage was indeed a theophic culture. And of course, war and genocide are nothing more than modern-day sacrificial rituals, which is why there is such a push always for war and genocide. I want to thank you all for your time and attention today. I've been Mel Ve. It's been a pleasure. Please stay tuned in for our next episode of The Office.